Welcome to the All Kids Can podcast, dedicated to supporting parents on their journey to nurture happy, successful children in every facet of life, particularly their journey through their education. Whether you're navigating the complexities of a recent diagnosis or you're finding that your child is struggling to have success with their learning, this podcast is for you. As a parent, you have incredible power and influence in your child's life. And with the right knowledge and strategies, you will be empowered to guide your child towards their best life. I'm your host, Christy Howarth, accredited dyslexia therapist, special education teacher, family coach, and mum of two brilliantly neurospicy kids of my own. Are you ready? Let's dive in. Welcome back to the All Kids Can podcast. Today I have Steph Robertson with me. She is a multiply neurodivergent occupational therapist, mother and lived experienced advocate. There's a bit to unpack there. We'll do that later. Steph is passionate about neurodivergent-affirming practices and facilitating a shift in how we view neurodiversity. Steph has nearly a decade of clinical and master's research experience, 13 years of parenting experience, and 35 of lived experience as a gifted, autistic, ADHDer with CPTSD. Now, I Googled that, Steph, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Yes.
Okay, and a dissociative disorder. So Steph says that I hope to be part of the change that means children today won't need to live with the trauma the way that I do. Steph, that is really powerful. Firstly, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
It's really good to have you here because I know that you have a heap of lived experience and a wealth of knowledge that we can use to empower ourselves as parents when we are raising neurodivergent kids, when often, a lot of the time, we don't know what the heck we're doing. And so to get the insight of someone that has lived it can really be it can be a gift for us as parents. So I'm really excited for you to be chatting to us today. So where do we start? Tell us a little bit, Steph, about why did you become an OT? Let's start at your OT position.
Okay. So the OT story of how I became an OT isn't really all that exciting. I didn't know what I wanted to do, like so many other kiddos who finish high school and are like, now what? So I actually met an OT at a party when I was at uni studying a health science degree because I had no idea what I wanted. And there was just a feeling that came over me when she told me what her job was. And I was like, whoa, like this exists, someone whose job it is to really find out what is important and meaningful to an individual and help them do that. I was like, all right, I'm sold. And so that's how I became an OT. When I was studying, I either wanted to work with children or in like geriatrics with the elderly population. And then when I graduated, I fell into a pediatric position straight away. And that's where I was for a long, long time. And then when I started my own business, I decided I was going to specialize in neurodivergent care. And so then I expanded to supporting some adults as well as children.
Excellent. So Steph, you mentioned with the OT work when you found out like what OTs do, how did you describe it? Like, so they can do what they need to do. What does an OT do? What occupational therapist?
So to break it down really simply, we often get asked, do you help people go back to work? You know, you hear like occupational rehab and stuff like that. And that's not really it. An OT's role is to specialize in the intersection between the person, the environment in which they're in, and the occupation in which they're doing. So an occupation refers to anything you do that occupies your time. Right. So like we're doing occupations all the time. And they fall under categories like self-care, leisure, productivity. If you look at like the frameworks and stuff of OT, but it's almost like we're detectives and problem solvers. So we look at someone's capacity, where they have strengths and resources, where they might have challenges. We look at what's meaningful and important to them. And then it's our role to work out how we enable the person to do what's important. And it might mean changing the environment. It might mean altering the occupation, and it might mean upskilling or supporting the person or the individual. So it's very broad.
Yeah, and I suppose that's why you kind of niche down into, say, pediatrics, and then you would have more of a focused approach then, particularly if you're working with kids maybe that are autistic or that have those difficulties within the school environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So, so let's talk a little bit about your experience, Steph, and what you can bring, what kind of knowledge that you can bring to parents that perhaps have kids that are struggling in an environment, i.e. like the school system, because they're neurodivergent. How can we help these kids firstly avoid school trauma and help them thrive? Is it possible to help kids thrive in an environment that's not maybe really tailored towards them, how they learn?
I think we absolutely can. I also feel, though, that we need systemic change, because if we're really going to embrace neurodiversity and this paradigm shift, what we're actually asking society to do is acknowledge that differences in neurology are a natural and normal part of the human experience. So someone who is autistic, ADHD, OCD, there are just so many under that umbrella of neurodivergence. But if we treat differences as a normal presentation, then having accommodations would just be the norm. There would be options. It wouldn't be one size fits all, whether it's in our workplaces or our schools. So I think there is space for that, but we need an entire societal shift, which is going to take some time, and it's happening. Having said that, though, I think it's definitely possible in our current systems for us to support children in a way that meets their needs. But the biggest barrier that I found so far is even when we have teachers, parents, staff who are willing and wanting, sometimes they're under-resourced, which is, again, a department-based issue, to be able to actually provide. Maybe it's one-on-one support that the child needs. Maybe it's a different space for them to be in that reduces the sensory overwhelm or whatever. So some schools are going to be geared up better to provide a child what they need more so than others. And it's kind of a higher up issue, in my opinion.
Yeah. And it's sort of falls under what the priorities or the discretion of the leadership and what they think is important, and whether they are trained and educated about inclusive practices and therefore implementing them within the school, because we know that there's a lot of leadership in different schools that have really not much clue about how to assist these kids within school, which does, cause trauma for kids throughout their school experience. Can you tell us a little bit, Steph, about your experience at school? How did you go?
I think because I was considered gifted academically, that side of school wasn't a challenge for me. The social side of school was more of a challenge. I think my memories of school are fragmented, and I don't know if that is like just that trauma thing or the stress associated with it. But I do recognize in a way my privilege that the academic side of things wasn't challenging. So I never had that level of stress of feeling like I was falling behind or not being able to digest the content being offered to me. I didn't realize until much later in life how much I struggle in situations like schools where there are lots of people in the one space. It's very loud. The sensory element, I think, was really hard for me. but I was incredibly high masking. Like I had it all sorted. And I even remember I would have been in year 7, I think. And I looked over at a table of other girls. I was in an all-girls school at that point, and they were communicating just by looking at each other. You know, that thing where they pull a face and the other one knew what it meant. And I remember my mind was blown in that moment because I was like, I don't know. There's a form of communication happening here that I do not understand at all. And that was when it was like I started chameleoning and mimicking and trying to blend in and appear neurotypical. And I guess it just went under the radar because I did quite a good job of that. And then it wasn't until much later in life that, you know, when I first had experienced burnout, that I was like, I can't maintain this mask and facade anymore. But I do think I was really lucky, in a sense, getting through school, particularly primary school. High school, on the other hand, was horrendous. But I think that's because I experienced my first phase of burnout when I was in high school. So, and there were not supports offered at all, really. I think a lot has changed since I was at school, thankfully. I mean, I'm 35 now, so do the math. I don't do numbers. When they were doling out the autistic gifts, maths was not one of mine. But, you know, I did have individual teachers who really made a difference to me because they took the time to see me and almost let me unmask a little bit and recognized my quirks and fostered my interests. So I often say to teachers, you know, it only takes one to change a kiddo's entire experience of education if you can be a support person. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. A bit tangential, but that's what I do.
Yeah. There is a little bit that I want to talk about with what you've just said, and that is particularly masking, because it's a term that we hear a lot of now. Well, I don't know. I think I do. Maybe I'm just in the circles. I don't know. But masking is something that I've experienced firsthand with my own son. He was trying to fit into a mainstream school, and initially, throughout the first probably 2 to 3 years, he was not fitting in at all, like, because he was younger, he was quite immature. There was a lot of outburst and a lot of emotions, and he didn't fit in at all. And then suddenly, I think it was about grade 3, something clicked like this. And then he started waking up and then just almost like robotically maybe putting on his school uniform, getting all of his things, and just without me having, because we had a lot of school refusal or school can't going on as well up until that point. But then suddenly he was just willing to go, and he was just doing it and putting on his uniform and getting out of the house and getting out of the car, because that transition of getting out of the car was always one of our biggest challenges ever. And then for a good, like, maybe a year and a half, I think, everything from my perspective was going really well. Like, okay, so all of that hard work that we've put in prep 1 and 2, you know, maybe it's all paid off now. Maybe, you know, we've done all the transitioning and we've done all of this. But then there was this one incident when he was at school, and I won't go into the details, but he was embarrassed in front of his peers, and it was just not a very nice situation for him to be in. And then suddenly it was like the switch was flicked again, and we were back to the start, and he couldn't go anymore. He hasn't been back since. And then upon reflection of that, Steph, I realized that what was happening in the last year and a half previous to that was he was highly masking. He hadn't changed. Nothing had fundamentally changed about him. He'd just figured out how to act like all the other kids. And so that was a huge awakening for me about what masking is. But from your perspective, how do we define masking? How do we recognize it in our kids? Is it a bad thing? Because from a parental perspective, sometimes it feels like it's good, but I know that it's not good because I know in your experience, you experienced burnout by the time you got into high school. Tell us a little bit about what masking is.
Masking is such an incredibly complex topic that I have explored a lot. And the thing with masking is, so there's an element of what they call impression management that all people do, neurotypical, everyone, where we do kind of think about how we come across towards others and how we're going to be perceived, and we alter ourselves a little bit in line with that.
Right.
The key difference that the research is finding with masking is that most often people who are not having to mask, as the word is used for neurodivergent people, their goal of their impression management is a positive one. So they may act a certain way to get a job at an interview, or they may do this certain thing to make this friend. So it's a toward-based thing, like I'm going to get something positive out of this. Masking, on the other hand, is usually done to avoid a negative. Right. So it's to avoid harm, to avoid judgment, to avoid shame, to avoid a perceived safety issue, right?
Okay.
And the research is showing that masking in autistic people is generally based on that. So it's not because they're trying to get something, it's because they're trying to avoid harm.
Okay.
And often this starts from stigma that we simply just have in society around difference. And people start to feel that. We find that usually kiddos by the age of about 5 or 6 will be recognizing, so peak school transition time, that for some reason they just feel a little bit different to their peers if they are neurodivergent or whatever. Then they start recognizing that there's a certain way of doing things and everyone else seems to just be doing it and getting it. And they're like, I don't, and that doesn't feel quite right, but everyone else is doing it and I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm going to go along with this. Now, you can imagine how hard it would be to try to be something that you're not all of the time, or pretend to be something. Eventually it's going to get really exhausting because it's not organic and it's not in line with your values and your identity and sense of self. The trouble also is that when kiddos start masking so early, and it's often unconscious because it's like a trauma response. It's like, I'm doing this to keep safe. As their identity forms, they then don't know what authentic self is either. So then we start addressing masking and like, it's safe to unmask. But then the person's like, but I don't know what that even looks like because I haven't been able to develop in line with what I needed. So the other thing that I would add here, especially related to schools, is often kiddos, and it sounds like this is what happened to your little boy, will go into a freeze, fawn, flop, very compliant state of masking where they go into that autopilot, they do everything expected of them, and so they go under the radar. People don't think that child is struggling.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and if we relate that to the polyvagal theory, that there is 2 sort of stress responses we can have, one being our fight or flight, our sympathetic nervous system, and the other being like a dorsal vagal response, which is where I'm going to sort of dissociate. I'm going to cut off from my body. And this goes unnoticed. And in my opinion, I actually feel like a child in that state, while they're not as problematic in air quotes for others around them, they're suffering more. It's like it's almost like a deeper sense of disconnection from society, from other people, from meaningful relationships. And often what can be hard is as we work on allowing a child to express themselves, they may move through almost like up the scale and experience more of that sympathetic response. They might start having certain behaviors that are forms of communication, or they might start really changing. And people think that's bad. They're like, oh no, they're escalating in inverted commas. What they're really doing is starting to feel again and respond to that and try to communicate their needs. So in a way, I see that as a positive shift when we start seeing that, because it's almost like they're stepping into a sense of advocacy finally, of like, I'm not just going to tolerate this, but I'm going to show some form of resistance because it's uncomfortable. And then that allows us to go, okay, let's get to the root of what is the unmet need. How do we allow it to be met across all environments so that this child can begin even exploring what their own organic, authentic expression might look like?
Yeah. There's a lot to it. And then, I mean, how you said that it's difficult particularly when kids are so in that stage of development where they are ideally starting to figure out who they are and develop their identity, and then when it's all masked and they just try to maybe subconsciously or unconsciously, act like all the other kids. How do you unmask? How do you help a child unmask? Just allow them to be in a safe space, I'm guessing.
So the way again, it's going to be different for each individual kiddo, but if I go a general way, I like to look at a person's sensory preferences first. So I go, let's go back to the body and not the mind, because it's usually our mind that's operating this masking thing, right? And then it's blocking the body, stopping the stimming, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But I'll explore a sensory thing with a kiddo, maybe do a sensory assessment and really look at what their nervous system's asking for, which is done by kind of analyzing different responses that child might have. Once I know about their sensory profile and what that looks like, I might start changing the environment to meet the needs of the sensory stuff. Because as we offer opportunities for the child to do things in a different way, so that might mean, for example, they're able to advocate for doing their work lying on the floor rather than sitting in a chair, or they can choose to sit on a wobble stool or use noise cancelling headphones or all that kind of stuff that might be available in the environment. If we start seeing changes in their regulatory state with that, then I know we're kind of on the right path to letting them regulate the body first and learn what feels good for them. Because again, if they haven't had the opportunity to know what feels good, it's like going on a journey of experimenting with different ways of being and finding out what actually feels good for them. When we're talking about younger kiddos, in terms of analyzing what's working, what's not, we kind of have to be the observer and go, actually, I've noticed this child is appearing far more regulated and engaged when XYZ supports are in place. As kiddos get older and I work on their interoceptive awareness, so what do they know about how their body feels? So often neurodivergent people really struggle with interoception. Like they're just like, I don't know what, they don't know. So really just learning about what are my body cues that tell me that I need something or that I want something or that this feels right or this feels wrong. And then building autonomy and being able to advocate for that across environments, which calls upon our teachers and our parents to really listen to our kiddos when they tell us this feels good, this feels bad, I don't like this, I do like this, and honor it and allow them to develop that sense of autonomy.
And not just force them into one way of doing things because that's what we expect of them, but really listening and allowing them to explore how they feel in different situations.
Yeah.
So that takes a lot of awareness, I think, doesn't it, as a parent? Which is why having you on here and helping us understand all of that is just so important, to have that awareness, because I think that we come from a generation that we've been parented in the way that there is a solid expectation on how we should be behaving, isn't there? And we're really crashing down those walls and breaking the mold around that and letting kids be who they are, regardless maybe of what society expects.
Absolutely. And I get asked a lot by parents, if we say we're talking about like that low demand approach, which people have probably heard spoken about quite a lot, and, giving children more autonomy and things like that. And parents will often ask me, but like, what do I do if now my kiddo has no boundaries, no rules, they're just doing what they want all the time, all of that kind of stuff? How do I support my child to be able to be a functioning member of society when they grow up or get a job or whatever? What I've found to be really interesting through anecdotal experience, but also, what we know about research and development, is that human beings don't want to be ostracized from the group. If we think about cavemen, we don't want to be kicked out of the cave because then we would be unsafe and something might eat us. So we naturally want to be connected to the other people within our communities and societies. So when you see a child behaving in a way that is having them ostracized, so whether it's, challenging behaviors, in my air quotes, and behaviors of concern or things like that, which are breaking down relationships, that is for a deeper reason. So if we think about children who are, say, demand avoidant, you know, we hear a lot about pathological demand avoidance nowadays, and then we take a low demand approach, the child is organically going to seek connection again when their nervous system is regulated. They are going to want to be part of the group, whether that means going back to school, whether that means engaging in their learning, whether it means, you know, creating social connections or whatever. That is a natural human response, and that will occur once we are regulated. So if parents are feeling like there's no light at the end of the tunnel right now, or they've got a child who's very resistant to participating in school or whatever because they don't have capacity right now, from my experience, when we reduce demands and we focus solely on a felt sense of safety for that child, they organically begin increasing their need, their want, their capacity to participate in things again. So it's a trust the process kind of thing. And I understand that that's so difficult. And parenting in today's day and age is very difficult as well, because there are so many different views and different ideas about what's right and what's wrong and all this kind of thing. But I often say to parents too that your intuition is incredibly powerful, and you are the expert on your own child, and you may have a feeling that something is just the right thing or the wrong thing for them, and others are suggesting something else. It's okay to listen to what you know.
Yeah. I feel that really deeply because I go on my intuition a heck of a lot with my son. And it's not the norm a lot of the time, but I know what's right for him. But even though I know, I still second guess myself all the time. Am I doing the right thing? And, you know, you get judgments and all the other people's comments and all of that. You have to bat all that off as well when you're really not walking that typical line, I guess. And what you said about taking the pressure off our kids that do have that, what did you call it? Like the like
Demand
sort of,
avoidance.
yeah. So what, PDA? So my son, again, whenever we pressure him, whether it be into a social situation or whether it be to go to school or whether it be anything, as soon as we start pressuring him, like, he will turn the other way. But then when we take the pressure off, and for example, we took him out of that mainstream school and he's doing a online homeschool curriculum, now he's going through almost a bit of a healing process, and he's doing exactly what you said, Steph. He's saying, I want to go, you know, I want to connect with kids. Like, I've got online friends from his online school, but I want to be a part of that connected kid network. Like, you know, but before that, he had no capacity to do that because he was in that fight or flight, right? So we see the fruits of, you know, when we follow what we know is right for kids, and when we take the pressure off, when we change the environment, when we give them accommodations or adjustments, we give it time, we do see that change eventually, right?
Yeah, and that's it. And if we go back to when I referenced the polyvagal theory, that theory highlights that there are those three pathways: the dorsal vagal, which is that shutdown that I mentioned, the sympathetic, which is fight or flight. Then there's the ventral vagal, which Stephen Porges, who developed this theory, called the social engagement pathway. And this is the pathway that when we're in it, which means when we're regulated, we will seek out engagement. That's natural human nature. So and I love that you're seeing this as an example. And I think the more we share these lived experience examples of kiddos going through that recovery, the more empowerment, I guess, we can give to parents who are maybe at that baseline where their poor kiddo can't get out of bed in the morning and they've really hit that burnout phase. But I think more and more, when we see it anecdotally, we see people trying this low demand approach, and then in varied time frames, we inevitably seem to be seeing improvement in their state of well-being, and then they start wanting to engage again. And when we do that in a space of giving them some autonomy over choosing what that re-engagement looks like, we avoid taking those steps back to them feeling kind of re-traumatized or they were given this sense of freedom to recover, and then we're taking that away again. We sort of really need to stay with it and follow their interests and what they're ready for, and also recognize that capacity is fluctuating. So your kiddo during their recovery phase, it may not be linear at all, and you may have good days and bad days, and there will be some days when they can and some days when they can't, and all of that's okay too. I think there is definitely part of challenging the neuronormative structure that capacity doesn't always have to be consistent, and that's normal and natural as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's so important to recognize, because sometimes you can feel like, oh, yes, we're on a winning streak. This is going really well. And then they just have a really, really bad day. And you're like, well, what went wrong? What were the triggers for that? And then you try to overanalyze it. But really, to understand that your capacity is sort of on this sort of roller coaster. And that is what life really is for all of us, though, isn't it? As well, we all have good days and bad days. Yeah, and I think that for some of our kids, it's just a little bit more extreme, a little bit more highs and lows.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think parents too, if you guys have access to supports for yourselves as parents, I think it's incredibly important. I'm not sure that the toll that it takes on parents' well-being is adequately understood and therefore supported as well. I think there needs to be a sense of it's actually okay and perfectly natural and normal for you as a parent to be having that response of, I don't know what I'm doing. This is very isolating. It's scary. I love my kiddo and all I want is to help them, but I don't know how. Like, all of this is a completely natural response. And I think that also needs to be validated, and we need more support for parents as well directly who are supporting these kiddos.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Steph. I think that's really important. So you were talking about how our kids, particularly those that are autistic, that have that, do we call it disassociation from social structures, or social, like a limited capacity to maybe connect with people. But then when they do have the capacity, there's no issue, right? But then tell us a little bit about what you've talked about, because I listened to your podcast, which is Alphabet Soup, which I will link in the show notes. But one of the episodes really resonated hard with me, and that was about the double empathy problem. And you have a really great way of explaining what that is. Can you enlighten us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I love the double empathy problem. This was a term coined by a researcher whose name I cannot bring to my head right now. I can see it, but I can't bring it to my head. But basically, it implies the fact that the research found that when autistic people communicate with other autistic people, they do not have the same challenges that they have if they are communicating with neurotypical people. So the point here is that it's not the autistic or the neurodivergent person's failing or ineptitude or anything like that. It's simply a difference. And I often simple it down with the analogy about, Mac versus PC, right? So you might be a Mac user or a PC user, but you know that if you try to run the apps for the other with what you've got, it's not going to work. That's not because there's anything wrong with your computer or your phone or your system. It's just that it's not supported to do that. If you use the right software, the right apps, the right whatever, it's perfectly fine. Off it goes. And it's a bit the same with neurodivergence, particularly if we're talking about autistic people, because that's where the research has been done. But this is why I think neurodivergent people need their neurokin. They need to actually be connected to and spending time with people who are also neurodivergent in the way that they are, because it allows for that experience of being seen and being connected and not feeling othered, which is generally what happens when we've got the minority of neurodivergent people in amongst this neuronormative society. And so I guess the reason that I use that analogy is because, if you are autistic or neurodivergent, you're not a broken PC, you're just a Mac. Does that make sense? And so we need to actually shift the way we are engaging people so that the systems work for them. And now more and more research is coming out about the differences in different types of brains, particularly around autistic and ADHD brains, and the fact that their processing systems are quite different in a lot of ways. I'll give you one interesting example because I could nerd out on this forever. But I don't know if you've heard the term monotropism, but it is fascinating. So they're finding now that most autistic brains and possibly ADHD brains, but not as much research has been done, are monotropic. This means that they tend to be more able to focus in on one task at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this like kind of tunnel vision on something, which has often been called hyperfocus in a lot of people, things like that.
Yep.
Polytropic minds are able to kind of attend to multiple things at once, or they're able to shift from their attention from one thing to another. So you can be doing something, someone calls your name. It's easy enough to just be like, oh yeah, what? Yep. Okay. Yep. Focus on what they want, then go back to your task. For monotropic minds, that is so hard for them to do. So once you interrupt their flow,
Yeah.
then they try to go back to their flow, and it's all been broken down. It's really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Schools, generally polytropic environments. We want kiddos transitioning from this subject to this subject after only 30 minutes. And then now it's recess. So now you're outside, then you're inside, and your attention's on this. Oh, now different classroom because it's art, different teacher. All of that, every single transition that a monotropic mind has to make across that day is going to require so much energy.
And that's where the transition difficulties come into as well. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And what we're finding is really helpful is actually allowing time. Like someone said, I was watching this thing, Kieran Rose, he's fantastic. He's he's called the autistic advocate, I think. He's based in England, and he said something like, if a child is really focused on an activity and then the bell rings and it's time to move on to something else, like, what if we didn't make them? What if we were like, oh, I'm going to just let you finish that? Like, if the staffing was available, for example, for the child to stay inside and not go out to recess or whatever, like, what if there was just flexibility and a bit more patience to allow transitions to be done in the time that's needed? All these things that are now coming out and this deeper understanding of how best to support neurodivergent minds. I think if we can get these ideas into school systems and just let go of the rigidity a little bit about how things have always been done, I think that could be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, that's a great thing to note for people that are trying to suggest to schools different accommodations or adjustments to, well, not only the curriculum, but the functionings of the day-to-day, the transitions and bits and pieces allow more time during transitions. And there's research behind that. And I love that concept of monotropic and what was it? Polytropic. So mono means one, right? And poly means many. I definitely have a monotropic mind. I just get stuck on one thing, and then I find it really difficult to get off it until I've finished it. Whereas I just get started if I have to do.
There's beautiful research around the experience of being what they've called monotropic flow. And they find that when people get in that flow state, it's almost like a full body experience. It's very common for anything external to be blocked out. So like name will be called, they'll miss it. But that, especially when it's involved in like an intrinsically motivated and really focused special interest task, that it's a full body, like almost like a euphoric state that people report that they get in. And this is in autism and ADHD so far. They're looking into this from my understanding. And I think to myself, if we look at that as a strength, rather than seeing it as a deficit or being like, oh, they can only focus on this thing or they can't transition and all this negative based focus, what if we go, yeah, but they can really get into a flow state? And also what they're finding in the research is that when someone's in a flow state, they learn incredibly quickly and the knowledge gets absorbed into like long-term memory and is really ingrained, as opposed to that kind of superficial rote learning.
Yeah.
So what if we go with our kiddos, okay, we're going to support their learning in an area that they're motivated towards, so they're more likely to be in that state. And then we're going to allow them to absorb themselves in that and really digest the learning. And then when they're ready to move on to another topic to digest, which they will do, facilitate that. And why does it have to be a negative? Like, do you know what I mean? I don't know why we've got this idea that we have to be so polytropic, especially in schools. Like we have to do all of these different things or.
Well, that's the way that the system is set up to create workers that are able to transition from one task to the next, right?
Yeah.
I think that it is so often seen as a deficit to have that monotropic mind, because we are basing diagnosis on the DSM. So it is all based around deficit and the ways in which they can't interact with a polytropic society. In a polytropic society, I don't even know if I'm using the right grammar here.
Yeah.
But it is like, how do you not fit into that model? And if you don't fit into that model, there's something wrong there, and that's the deficit. So we're going to give you this diagnosis and we're going to try and work on those things. But what you're saying is just flipping it and allowing kids to really run with it and experience all of the gifts that come with that kind of mind.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think too, school is not representative of what life is like anyway. So for example, you know, I often hear things like, oh, but in the real world, they'll have to X, Y, Z. Now, yes, as an autistic person myself, I would love it if I could go to a busy festival and feel comfortable with that. Like, yeah, that would be nice. But I don't. So I don't. And I can choose that because I'm a grown-up. So my point being that when we get older, we actually have more autonomy to choose how we're going to use our brain and what job we want to do and what suits us and what environments we want to engage in and all that kind of stuff. Again, I'm checking my privilege here that I'm really, really lucky that I'm in a job where I work for myself and I can create environments. I know not everyone is that lucky and privileged to have that. But also, if there are things that someone really, I'll give a base example. Handwriting is one thing that often gets stressed a lot in schools, or pencil grip, for example. And then we have kiddos who maybe be dysgraphic or maybe just have challenges with their motor control, or that literacy in general is really challenging. And my question is, does it really matter long-term if that child can write a 3-page essay? Could they get by in life and do everything else and type instead? Probably. Could we implement things like talk to text? Could we implement things that read text aloud through technology? We have so many assets now. Can we actually create more accessibility where someone, like, it's almost like they're, how do I say this? This is probably getting a little bit out there, but it's almost like, what if their deficit, again in inverted commas, is seen as just what is, like being right or left-handed. And then because that is what is, we just offer a different alternative.
Yeah. Like we do when we're adults and we can choose what we want to do based around how we're built, maybe.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And look, if someone wants to be able to write, if it's an intrinsically motivated goal for them and they're like, I just want to be able to do that, great. Of course, we're going to work on it. Like, I'm not saying ignore it completely. I'm just saying that when we're looking at what we want to support someone with, I always go back and check in with, is this goal or is this thing we're trying to work towards for the benefit of that individual? Or is it because it's based around a societal norm or a goal that belongs to somebody else? So if this child does this, it's going to be easier for the teacher. It's not about their well-being, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree with you. And a lot of the time, these difficulties, say, that kids experience when they are dysgraphic or they have difficulty with writing, it's really a problem because they need to be doing it because of the schooling system has said, this is what you have to do right throughout high school. You need to be able to do this. And that's where it becomes difficult, and that's where it becomes stressful for the child and for the parent, because there's a whole big road ahead of them. And if they wish to opt into that road, which, I mean, it's illegal not to, isn't it? I mean, we have to do up to year 10 high school. But there are always other options. There is homeschooling, there is unschooling, there are, like you said, there's accommodations and adjustments that we can use for speech to text and all of those sorts of things as well. What you're sort of talking about is sort of leaning me into more of a strength-based viewpoint of how to enable kids to feel success by not only focusing on those deficits that perhaps aren't entirely essential or important, because there's other ways of managing it, but really also focusing on what they can do well.
100%. And like, we all know how good it feels when you have a sense of achievement, right? We know through research that when people are intrinsically motivated towards something, so they're not being sort of forced to attend to it, but rather there's an interest that's sparked and they want to know about it, they learn so much more quickly. In children specifically, we know that in terms of building synapses in the brain, children can do that, like, I'm picking a number out of nowhere, but like 500% more quickly when they're doing it through play than when they're doing it through rote learnt approaches. There are statistics on that, and I can't think of what it is. It was like through play, it takes 10 repetitions, but through other forms of formal teaching, it took like hundreds. So the difference is really, really incredible. And that's because play, is a child's primary occupation, coming back to an OT perspective. That is what children are designed to do. That is how they learn. They're not designed to sit at desks. That's just not what our human body was designed to do at that age, or at any age, really. But children will learn more and engage more by doing things, by experiencing things. And this is often what our neurodivergent kiddos need. You know, if I go a little bit tangential again, I wonder if actually that's what all kiddos need, but the neurotypicals are kind of better at sinking into this box that's been created. But yeah, it almost seems like a no-brainer. You know, we see neurodivergent people all the time that are entrepreneurs or creating massive changes in the world or inventing new systems, but that's because they were given the opportunity to go down that rabbit hole that was of their interest and their passion, and look how it turned out. Like, I just don't see how it's a bad thing. And then I see all these goals about, you know, wanting to deter someone from, again, in inverted commas, you know, their obsessions and things like that. And I'm like, why though?
Yeah. I love your perspective, Steph. It's been such an interesting conversation, and I hope that everyone listening has also thought the same thing, and I'm sure they have. Steph, if people want to follow you up and come and stalk you on Instagram and find out all of the things that you have to offer, where do they find you?
So my Instagram is SGR Occupational Therapy. Very original. Those are my initials. I'm not a great namer of things. My website's the same, sgroccupationaltherapy.com. On Facebook, it's SGR Holistic Occupational Therapy. But the biggest place that I'm most active is definitely on Instagram, where I share the most, and probably there. And I welcome people to reach out. I love connecting with the community. I've got some on-demand like resources and stuff available on my website that people can access straight away if it's going to be helpful. Yeah, and like at the moment, my consulting capacity is pretty limited, but I'm always, you know, I'll always do what I can to try to help people out when they're in a bind. And I think it's becoming clear more and more that more people are needing that support around advocacy for their child across environments like schools. So yeah,
that's right. Yeah. Thanks again, Steph. And I'm going to link all your details below in the show notes. And thanks for your time today.
Thanks so much, Christy. It's a pleasure.
You've been listening to the All Kids Can podcast. For the show notes for this episode, visit allkidscan.com.au/podcast and search for this conversation. If you like what you've heard on today's episode, I would be grateful if you could take a minute to leave a rating or a review. Thank you for helping us grow and be visible to parents who can benefit from the information in this show. Lastly, if you're not already part of the All Kids Can community, sign up at our website for your free weekly newsletter, links to new podcast episodes, and up-to-date information on our offerings. Head to allkidscan.com.au to sign up and learn more.